It was supposed to be just another quiet Halloween afternoon, until a teenage boy stepped inside his home and found a nightmare no one could have imagined. 3 family members gone. No screams, no signs of a break-in. And the killer? Someone they knew better than anyone. This is the chilling story of how love, loyalty, and trust turned into one of the most shocking family tragedies you'll ever hear. This is True Crime's Altar, where every sin is punished, every betrayal has a cost, and every soul must answer to the truth. Like, comment, and subscribe, because these are the stories the guilty prayed would stay buried. It began with an unsettling stillness. No shouts, no crashing glass, just a teenager stepping through his own front door into something no one should ever witness. 3 family members lay dead, and the house showed no sign of forced entry. Who could have done it, and how long had they been inside waiting? It was early afternoon on October 31st when Kareem Vance walked into his family's home in Brentwood, South Carolina. In minutes, everything he thought he knew about safety and normal life would be gone. The place was usually alive with weekend sounds, but now it felt unnervingly still. No laughter, no chatter, just a heavy quiet that seemed to press against his skin. He called out, but no one answered. It was strange, but not enough to alarm him yet. Cars sat in the driveway, a sign that people should be home. Maybe everyone was napping, maybe the TV was off for once. Passing the living room, he headed upstairs toward his bedroom. The hallway was dim, the floor quieter than usual under his steps. Closing his door behind him, he sat down to play video games, convincing himself it was nothing. But as time passed, a nagging unease grew stronger. Marvina Vance never stayed in bed this late. Someone should have called out to him by now. Anything. He left his room and noticed the master bedroom door was ajar. A strange chill crept over him. He pushed it open and saw 2 still shapes beneath the comforter, the blanket drawn high over their faces. He stepped closer, expecting some movement, a stretch, a groan, something. Nothing came. He spoke, but there was no reply. Then his eyes caught a bare foot sticking out. Reaching down, he tapped a leg. No movement. He pulled the blanket back, and the world shifted. Blood soaked the pillow, running down the side of the mattress, far too much for any explanation his mind could handle. His hand trembled as he reached for the second figure. Another lifeless face, another bloody pillow. His thoughts scrambled for answers, maybe a prank, maybe some Halloween setup. That illusion lasted only seconds before reality snapped into place. He staggered back, bolted from the room, raced downstairs, and burst out the front door. On the lawn, he called a relative, his voice cracking into broken fragments, panic flooding every word. Something was terribly wrong. By the time help arrived, Kareem was still outside, pacing and crying, asking the same question no one could yet answer. What happened in there? The first deputy pulled up minutes after the 911 call. From the outside, the Vance home looked untouched. No broken glass, no kicked-in door, no commotion, just a teenager, pale and trembling, unable to go back inside. What the deputy found beyond the threshold would haunt even seasoned officers. The master bedroom was dim, curtains drawn. 2 bodies lay side by side under the comforter, faces soaked in blood. No sign of a struggle. The positions were too calm, as if sleep had been broken by sudden, irreversible violence. Backup was called immediately. Within the hour, the place swarmed with investigators, crime scene techs, and detectives. Each room was searched in silence until someone called from upstairs. Another door, locked from the inside. It was forced open. A third body lay curled on a twin bed, facing the wall. There were no bullet holes in the ceiling, no wide spray of blood, just a dark pool beneath the head and a claw hammer resting at the foot of the bed. The wounds were from repeated, deliberate blows. There had been no chance to cry out. 3 victims, all in the same house, all gone without a sound. Downstairs, investigators began sorting the fragments of the scene. The man in the master bed, Douglas Vance, had been shot 5 times in the head and face at close range. The way the blanket was tucked suggested he'd been killed in his sleep. Beside him, Marvina Vance had been shot 3 times in the head, but her body had shifted. A wound to her hand showed she had woken, tried to fight back. Blood spattered the walls, headboard, even the lampshade. No shell casings. No forced entry. No sign of theft. Whoever had done this had time, a plan, and left without panic. Detectives huddled outside reviewing the facts. No robbery, no screams from neighbors. But 2 residents were unaccounted for. One was Kareem, who had made the call. The other was missing entirely. No one had seen Torrance Vance since the night before. No one could yet say why the family had been targeted, but by sundown, officers had reached one disturbing conclusion. This was no random break-in. Whoever did it knew the home, knew who slept where. One more thing was missing: the family's white pickup truck. Kareem mentioned that earlier that morning, he'd seen someone in the driveway loading things into it, a familiar figure. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. Now it was the lead investigators needed. A be-on-the-lookout alert went out to surrounding counties. Back at the station, they dug deeper. The household was blended, with Douglas and Marvina each bringing children from prior relationships. While most got along, one member had always stood out: Torrance Vance, Douglas's adult son. Torrance didn't live there full-time, but came and went. The night before, he had been in the house. His record wasn't for theft or drugs, but for violence. Years earlier, there had been a physical altercation with one of the victims. Another time, he had stolen a car. Once, he'd struck a parent during an argument and threatened to take his own life when police were called. Mental health issues had been a constant in his life. Diagnosed in his teens with severe disorders, he had cycled in and out of treatment. When on medication, he could be calm. Off it, he was volatile. Despite repeated warnings, the family had kept the door open for him, though not without fear. Some relatives had urged Douglas to cut ties completely, but loyalty and maybe guilt kept boundaries loose. That weekend, Torrance had been invited back, fresh from a hunting trip with his father, who had taught him how to use a rifle. No one could have guessed it would be their last night together. Detectives worked on the timeline. Kareem had left for church that morning, and neighbors reported hearing what might have been gunshots shortly after sunrise. That left a tight window, too narrow for an outsider to break in and escape unnoticed, but enough time for someone who didn't need to break in at all. The missing truck, Torrance's violent history, and years of instability began forming a single picture. All they had to do now was find him. Just hours after the crime scene was locked down, word came from a deputy nearly 170 miles away. A white pickup matching the alert was parked outside a secluded cabin deep in the woods. The property belonged to the Vance family and was the same place Torrance had stayed with Douglas just days earlier during their hunting trip. Deputies moved in quietly. No movement inside, no sound. Then the door opened and Torrance stepped out, leaning on the porch post with a cigarette, expression unreadable. No surprise, no panic. He didn't run or resist. As officers closed in, another team searched the truck. Inside, they found a .22 caliber handgun and traces of blood. Ballistics would later confirm it was the weapon used on Douglas and Marvina. The wounds, the caliber, the distance, all matched. Torrance was taken into custody on the spot. Investigators began retracing his movements. Surveillance footage from a small gas station nearby showed him hours earlier, buying a sandwich and walking out without disguise or urgency. Back at the cabin, no other weapons were found. No alcohol, no drugs, just Torrance, waiting. Meanwhile, relatives confirmed what detectives feared. The tension between Torrance and the victims hadn't just existed, it had worsened. Arguments had turned physical. At least once, it ended with him being thrown out. Still, the family had kept allowing him back. He'd sleep on the couch, eat dinner at the table, part of the household, but never fully trusted. That weekend was one more chance. Maybe they believed things had cooled down. By sunrise, 3 were dead, and the only one missing was now found calm and silent at the same retreat where his father once took him to escape their troubles. At first, he said nothing in the interrogation room, just stared at the floor, elbows on the table. No emotion. Detectives waited. Soon, he asked for water, then asked what they'd found in the house. When they mentioned the gun, the blood in the truck, and the missing shell casings, he finally looked up. After a pause, he said quietly, "I didn't mean for it to be like that." What came next wasn't a neat confession, but fragments, years of resentment, feeling like an outsider in the home. He said they treated him like a visitor while they played family without him. He described Marvina as controlling, claiming she stirred conflict between him and Douglas, reopening old fights that sometimes got physical. He admitted to sexually assaulting her after killing her. Underneath the anger was dependency. He had no steady job, no income, relying completely on his father for money and a place to stay. Days before the murders, Douglas had talked about cutting him off unless he changed. That stuck with him. He said he snapped, claiming he hadn't planned to kill everyone, that it started with one and the rest blurred together. Detectives weren't convinced. He knew where the gun was kept. He'd wiped down surfaces, removed shell casings, and driven nearly 3 hours away. The blunt force used on Kareem Vance, they believed, was meant to silence him before he could alert the others. The gunshots came afterward, deliberate and precise. In the end, Torrance didn't really apologize, just said things had gone too far. When asked what he saw as he pulled the trigger, he replied, "Everything I wasn't part of." The case never reached a full jury trial. With the evidence stacked high, the murder weapon, the blood in the truck, the matching ballistics, the timeline, and his own admissions, the defense shifted focus. Instead of pushing for acquittal, they began negotiating to spare him from the death penalty. After months in custody, Torrance Vance stood in court and changed his plea to guilty on 3 counts of murder. There was no contest, no dramatic speech, just a quiet admission in front of a room filled with family members whose lives had been shattered. Judge Raymond Steele sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 3 consecutive life terms. Torrance did not look back as deputies led him away. For those left behind, the sentence offered no comfort. It was not closure, just confirmation that the man responsible would never walk free. Kareem Vance, the teenager who had found the bodies, never returned to that house. He moved in with relatives and for a long time refused to speak publicly about what he'd seen. 16 years old, he had walked into something most could never imagine, and it stayed with him. The Vance home sat vacant for months before it was sold quietly. Neighbors said the new owners never asked about its past. For the people who had known the victims, explanations were scarce and unsatisfying. Some blamed the system, pointing to years of warning signs, the violent outbursts, the psychiatric hospital stays, the family tension that never got resolved. Others blamed misplaced loyalty, saying that despite the red flags, Douglas kept his door open to Torrance, hoping each time would be different. In hindsight, many believed this wasn't just a triple murder. It was the final collision between untreated mental illness and years of unresolved family trauma. Everyone seemed to agree on one point. It didn't have to end this way, but no one stopped it in time. Torrance was only in his mid-20s when he began serving his sentence. From the moment he arrived, prison staff marked him as high risk, not just for what he had done, but for who he was. His mental health continued to spiral. He was withdrawn, volatile, and emotionally unstable. At times, he refused to take his medication. He kept to himself for long stretches, then clashed with guards or other inmates. Several times, he was placed on observation and later returned to the general population. The facility had seen worse, but few crimes as personal as his. Some staff members said they thought he carried guilt. Others believed he barely grasped the reality of what he had done. Torrance never gave interviews, never spoke publicly again. But in fragments of overheard conversations, one recurring theme emerged. He believed his family had erased him long before that night. In his mind, the killings weren't only about rage. They were about a complete breakdown, something he claimed no one had noticed or cared enough to stop. Less than 5 years into his sentence, Torrance was found dead in his cell. The cause was self-inflicted injury. There was no note, no farewell, just silence. His death officially closed the case, but not the pain it had left behind. Those still living were left to wrestle with questions that would never be fully answered. How had things fallen apart so badly? How many warnings had been missed? Why hadn't anyone stepped in before it reached this point? Kareem, now older, has never spoken publicly about that day. Those who once knew the family say he has moved far from Brentwood, trying to build a life free of headlines and haunted memories. In the end, the tragedy wasn't only the lives taken, it was the number of chances that had existed to prevent it and how every one of them slipped by. A family that kept trying, a system that kept failing, and a young man whose unresolved pain turned into something far more dangerous than anyone was willing to believe. A case closed, but never truly understood. Kareem's relatives remember the months after the murders as a blur of grief and confusion. He rarely spoke, often retreating to his room at his aunt's house and shutting the door for hours. If anyone asked about that afternoon, he would change the subject or walk away. The family tried to shield him from the media, but reporters still lingered around the neighborhood in Brentwood, hungry for details about the killings. Even years later, certain sounds, a sudden thud, a creak on the stairs would make him tense. He avoided Halloween altogether, staying indoors or leaving town when the date came around. For him, the holiday had lost any trace of joy. It was now forever tied to the worst day of his life. Meanwhile, Douglas and Marvina's friends organized memorials, speaking of their generosity, their love for family, and the way they opened their home even to those who had hurt them in the past. Some praised them for giving Torrance repeated chances. Others couldn't understand why they'd kept inviting him back. It was a split that would quietly linger in the community for years, between those who saw forgiveness as a virtue and those who saw it as a fatal mistake. The cabin where Torrance had been arrested remained in the family's name for a while, but no one wanted to visit it anymore. Once a place of bonding and peace, it had become a dark reminder of betrayal. Eventually, it too was sold off, the land changing hands without any mention of what had happened there. Officially, the case file was closed after Torrance's death in prison, but the unanswered questions lived on in hushed conversations among neighbors and relatives. Some wondered if Torrance's life could have been different with earlier, more consistent mental health intervention. Others believed the outcome had been inevitable, shaped by years of unresolved resentment and instability. For Kareem, there was no benefit in wondering. He focused instead on building a new identity far from Brentwood, where few knew his past. Yet those who have seen him in quiet moments say his eyes still carry the weight of that day, a look that tells you he's lived through something most people couldn't imagine. The murders had stolen not only 3 lives, but the sense of safety and trust that had once held their family together. And though time has passed, the shadows of that Halloween afternoon remain, stretching into the lives of everyone it touched. In the years since, Brentwood has quietly moved on, but for those connected to the Vance family, the wounds remain. The street where the house once stood unchanged now feels different to anyone who remembers. Neighbors who had lived there for decades still recall the flashing lights that filled the block that day and the disbelief that followed when the suspect turned out to be someone who'd grown up under that roof. Friends of Douglas and Marvina sometimes gather to share stories, keeping their memories alive through laughter and bittersweet reflection. Kareem's name rarely comes up in those circles, not out of neglect, but out of respect for his choice to stay out of the public eye. He has built a life far from the shadow of what happened, yet those close to him know the past is never entirely gone. It lives in quiet reminders, in small moments when something familiar pulls him back to that Halloween afternoon. What happened in the Vance home was more than a crime. It was a chain of missed chances, ignored warnings, and a tragedy that might have been prevented if the right help and boundaries had been in place. It is a reminder that danger can come from the places we least expect and the people we think we know best. If you've stayed with this story until now, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think could have been done to stop this before it happened? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories and tell us where in the world you're watching from.